Hi there. Hi. Good to see you again. Yes, always a pleasure, of course. Okay, let's jump right in, shall we? Because I do have another quick appointment I do have to make. But today I thought we could talk about two issues. One is the issue of which generation should pay for the unlawful withholding of the wages of 17 million workers in the United States and in the British colonies in the Caribbean. And the second one being the issue of wrongful imprisonment and what does that mean in the context of these workers. And so let's take the first one, which is who should pay. And for me, it's clear who pays for a nation's debts. If you look at England and you look, for example, at its national debts, that debt comprises many different expenditures. In 2015 or somewhere in that region, England completed paying off for um, 19th century debts that it had incurred when some of its citizens had unlawfully withheld 100% of the wages of millions of workers as a matter of practice. And then, in order to get those workers to and they did that with the authority of the British government, obviously. But in order to get them to stop, the government had to promise them a lot of money. And that was paid off in 2015. I mean, that's like 6 years ago. So that was paid for by many generations. That same transaction involved, as I said, approximately 17 million workers altogether between the colonies in the Caribbean and the United States. And those workers whose wages were withheld 100% for their entire lifetimes for a cumulative 244 years were paid zero by the government. Okay, but the debt was paid off in 2015, stemming from the 19th century. And one can imagine that some of the taxpayers were themselves descendants of workers who were never paid for their work. So, as far as which generation should pay, again, look at World Wars One and Two. Germany had to pay war debts after both wars, and Germany just recently finished paying off its debts to Israel and other places because of the Second World War. And it took up to 80 years or something of that nature to finish paying off for the First World War. So that was paid for by multiple generations. You have the United States, who has fought many wars since the Second World War, and the last one was in Afghanistan, which was ended just a few days ago by President Biden. That war was very expensive. That war cost the United States alone, because there were other allies involved, $2.6 trillion over 20 years. And that, according to Forbes, amounts to approximately 300 million US dollars per day, every day for 20 years. It's a lot of money. That wall was started in a different, not generation necessarily, but it was started by President George Bush after the attacks on New York in 2001. We're now 2021. That's 20 years. So 20 years ago. So different generations have been paying for that. But it's not over, because according to Forbes also, the US government had to borrow, the money to pay for this war in Afghanistan. And so there's going to be a lot of interest that accrues on that debt over the next 40 to 50 years. Conceivably, that debt, which is $2.6 trillion as of today, will balloon to $6.5 trillion in about 40 to 50 years or more, really, depending on, I guess, the rates of interest. So, um, which generation will pay for that? Many generations will pay for it. And well after I'm dead and Joe Biden is dead and many other people in this generation are dead, many other generations, new generations who are not even born yet, will be paying off a lot of these debts and and deficits. So the notion that, you know, the 17 million workers who were unlawfully enslaved between 1619 and 1865 in the British colonies and in the United States, um, cannot receive justice and cannot receive their back pay because this debt was incurred by another generation is not very persuasive, because it's quite the norm for multiple generations to pay off a nation's debts. And the irony is that in the case of, for example, Afghanistan, which is an example that most people should be able to wrap their heads around because it's real time, it's right now. The debt itself is important. The reason for the debt is important for people to consider because multiple generations of Americans are going to pay for this, $2.6 trillion debt, which was spent to fight for human rights of people across the world, people who deserve to have their human rights, but the notion that their human rights are so much more important than the human rights of people right here at home is a little bit difficult to understand because, you know, the workers who were not paid in this country, in the United States, in the West, if you will, had families, and for 244 years, 100% of their wages, their properties, just everything was confiscated by de facto employers and by governments and corporate entities. And so they had nothing to leave to their families for that duration of time. You can imagine that it will take at least 244 years or longer, perhaps exponentially longer, for their family members to catch up to this deficit. And you can see that, the data is there to show that the descendants of these workers are way behind the rest of society economically because of this economic blitzkrieg that was unleashed on their forebears for such a long period of time. So to say, well, these workers are all dead, so it doesn't matter, I think is beside the point, to put it politely, because their families are still here and their families are still suffering, and the data is there that clearly shows that there has been and is a lingering impact on the family members of these workers due to the 100% withholding of their, all of their property, all their wages for 244 years, um, by de facto employers and by governments. So there's that. And then the other issue I wanted to talk about was this issue of wrongful imprisonment. And you had asked me, well, why do I say they were wrongfully imprisoned since they were not really in prison? And I would have to respectfully disagree with that position, because the fact that they were not placed in a dedicated place that has the word prison written across of it doesn't mean that they were not in prison. They were very much in prison. They were not free to leave. There were laws that prevented them from leaving. I mean, if they tried to leave, private citizens were required to offer them up to the government so that they could be put back in their place and justice could be done for their slavers. And when you take someone out of their habitation, out of wherever it is that they live, and you shackle them and you put them in chains and you pack them up like cargo, on ships and you sail them across a perilous ocean, and then you bring them to this new place where you say that you bought them for $35, and they never said they were for sale, by the way. And and you completely ignore the fact that you know this property, this body is the property of someone inside of that body can describe that as my body, my cheeks, my nose, my ears, my hands, my heart. There's someone, her body, his body, their body, our bodies. you know there's a possessive pronoun there that should have clearly indicated to these human traffickers and slavers and merchants of illicit activity and people. um, they should have it should have been apparent that these bodies were owned already by someone, and that they needed the permission to take these people before they took these people and imprisoned them on these plantations for their entire lives. And it is particularly egregious, as I have said repeatedly, that no wrongdoing has ever been shown to have been committed by any of these individual workers. Approximately 17 million, according to some estimates. No wrongdoing at all. No adjudication had been done. No due process. These people were just randomly and arbitrarily and irrationally placed in this situation with the government's permission and with the monarchy's assent. And so for me, that's clearly a wrongful imprisonment because, again, they were not free to leave. So I'm not sure if that makes it any clearer for you, but they were wrongfully imprisoned because they were not free to leave. Their property rights to their bodies were totally taken away. They were deprived of all rights to their property, which by law they should have been able to retain as of right. Um, and this continued for their entire lives, and then they were forced to keep having more children so that their children upon birth could be subject to the same punishment. And that brings me to this point you made about well, it happened in biblical times, and I have to respectfully disagree with that. I mean, I read certain relevant portions in the Bible, and it seems that it was a totally different thing. These were not the same kinds of situation. I mean, in the biblical times, people were slaves for 7 years maximum, and they were to be treated in a certain and specific way. And once they were released after 7 years, their their masters were to give them property and capital and goods so that they could start their new lives as freed people. They were not divested of their humanity. They were not owned. They were not forced to provide their children for even one extra generation, never mind 17. And usually there was some reason for their